They were Savannah's picture-perfect family: Emma Ray Cartwright, a glamorous social media icon adored by millions, her husband, Officer Tom Cartwright, a respected and dedicated cop, and their teenage son, Mason, the pride of their tight-knit community. To the outside world, they had it all: fame, love, and the kind of perfection that others could only dream of. But behind the filtered photos and carefully crafted captions lay a web of secrets so dark, it would unravel in the most horrifying way imaginable. On a stormy night, a single gunshot shattered the illusion of their perfect life. Emma was found dead in her own home, her once flawless image forever stained by betrayal, obsession, and violence. The question that gripped the nation wasn't just who pulled the trigger, but why. What truth was so devastating, so unbearable, that it turned this picture-perfect family into the center of a brutal crime? When secrets fester beneath the surface, they create cracks too deep to repair. When love is twisted by obsession and trust is betrayed, the consequences can be deadly. This is the tragic and shocking story of Emma Ray Cartwright, an influencer whose carefully curated life was hiding something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the chilling details of this case, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to True Crime Files HQ for the most gripping tales of deception, scandal, and tragedy. Emma Ray Cartwright, born on April 17, 1985, in Savannah, Georgia, was a rising star in the world of social media. By 2022, at the age of 37, she had amassed over 2 million followers, drawn to her vibrant personality and the idyllic life she portrayed online. Emma was known for her Southern charm, her deeply rooted faith, and her ability to balance family and fame seamlessly, or so it seemed. Her brand was built on family-focused content, with posts that celebrated her traditional values, her perfectly styled home, and her devotion to her loved ones. Fans adored Emma's perfect marriage to Tom Cartwright, a 41-year-old police officer and local hero in Savannah. Tom had spent nearly 2 decades on the force, earning a reputation as a dedicated and compassionate officer who prioritized his community. Together, Emma and Tom appeared to be the epitome of a strong, loving partnership. Their story was one of love, faith, and perseverance. At least, that's how Emma presented it to the world. Central to Emma's online persona was her close bond with her only child, Mason Cartwright. Mason, who had just turned 18 in February 2023, was a standout student and athlete, excelling both academically and in track and field. His achievements were frequently highlighted in Emma's posts, where she called him her greatest blessing and a perfect son. To her followers, Mason was the golden boy, a role model for other teens and the embodiment of Emma's maternal success. However, Emma's rise to fame was not without its critics. As her following grew, so did the scrutiny. Some questioned the authenticity of her posts, claiming her life seemed too perfect to be real. Rumors swirled about the curated nature of her content, with whispers that her picture-perfect life might be a facade. Behind closed doors, the family dynamic wasn't as harmonious as it appeared. Tom, while deeply committed to his role as a husband and father, was beginning to notice changes in Emma. Her obsession with her online persona seemed to be consuming her, and their once strong bond was showing signs of strain. Mason, too, was feeling the pressure of being in the spotlight. The teenager, who had dreams of moving away for college, was grappling with the weight of his mother's expectations and her ever-tightening grip on his life. By mid-2023, the Cartwrights still appeared to be the picture of perfection to the outside world. But inside their carefully curated bubble, the cracks were becoming harder to hide. The weight of secrets, unspoken frustrations, and hidden tensions was threatening to tear their seemingly flawless lives apart. It was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. The lines between love, control, and manipulation began to blur in early 2023, shortly after Mason Cartwright's 18th birthday. Late-night conversations between Mason and his mother, Emma, initially felt innocent, a way for the two of them to connect in a house where appearances were everything. Emma, with her knack for making everything seem perfect on the surface, had always been close to her son, but this was different. These conversations became more frequent, more intense, and more personal. Mason felt flattered at first, thinking his mother confided in him because she trusted him, but soon, the dynamic shifted. Emma started to cross boundaries, and Mason, unsure of how to navigate the situation, found himself drawn into something far darker. Emma began framing their connection as special, something no one else could understand. She would tell Mason he was her rock, her reason for getting through the day. She emphasized how much she needed him, subtly weaving guilt into their interactions. When Mason later spoke to investigators, he described the relationship as something I didn't know how to stop. I thought it was love, but it wasn't right. Emma, for her part, seemed consumed by her growing obsession. She began isolating Mason from his friends, subtly discouraging him from spending time with anyone who might pull him away. "They're not good for you," she would say, or, "they're just jealous of how close we are." When Mason received a college acceptance letter in March 2023, Emma dismissed it entirely. She argued that staying local was better for the family and insisted that he wouldn't be happy moving away. Slowly but surely, Emma tightened her grip, ensuring that Mason's world revolved around her. The gift started soon after: expensive electronics, designer clothes, even a sleek new watch. Mason initially questioned the extravagance, but Emma waved it off, calling them tokens of her love and appreciation. Tom Cartwright, Emma's husband and Mason's father, wasn't blind to the changes happening in his home. A seasoned police officer with nearly 2 decades of experience, Tom's instincts had always been sharp, and by the summer of 2023, those instincts were screaming at him that something was wrong. Emma had grown distant, spending hours locked in her office, glued to her phone. When Tom asked what she was working on, she brushed him off, claiming it was for her social media brand. Mason, once an outgoing and confident teenager, seemed to have withdrawn into himself. He rarely left the house unless it was for school or track practice, and his bright personality had dimmed. The tipping point came late one humid night in August 2023. Tom couldn't sleep, his mind swirling with the unease he had felt for months. He went downstairs to the kitchen, hoping a glass of water would help, and noticed Emma's phone lying on the counter. Normally, she kept it with her at all times, like a lifeline. Tom hesitated. He knew he shouldn't invade her privacy, but the nagging feeling in his gut was too strong to ignore. He unlocked the phone and began scrolling through her messages. What he found stopped him cold. The texts between Emma and Mason weren't just inappropriate, they were damning. Messages filled with intimate language, photos, and declarations of a connection that crossed every imaginable line. Phrases like, "No one can ever know," and "I can't lose you," Mason, flashed on the screen, confirming his worst fears. Tom felt his chest tighten as the realization sank in. His wife, the woman he had loved and trusted, had betrayed him in a way he couldn't fathom. When Emma came downstairs and saw Tom holding her phone, her face froze. She snatched it out of his hands, her voice sharp and defensive. "What are you doing with my phone?" she demanded, her tone a mixture of anger and panic. "What the hell is this, Emma?" Tom's voice cracked with emotion as he held up the damning evidence on the screen. "Explain these messages. Explain this." Emma's response was immediate, but not what Tom had expected. Instead of admitting the truth, she doubled down. "You're paranoid, Tom. You're reading too much into things," she yelled, her face flushed with anger. "Those messages are taken out of context. You don't trust me anymore, that's the real problem here." But Tom wasn't buying it. The words on that screen couldn't be explained away, and Emma's deflections only fueled his rage. The betrayal was too deep, cutting him not just as a husband but as a father. His world, carefully built around trust, love, and family, was crumbling before his eyes. That night, the air in the Cartwright home was thick with tension. Words were exchanged, accusations hurled, but nothing was resolved. Tom's discovery had shattered the carefully constructed facade of their family, and the fallout from that moment would set off a chain of events that no one could stop. Emma's secret was out, and the cracks in their picture-perfect lives had turned into gaping chasms. Tragedy loomed just over the horizon. The tension in the Cartwright household reached a boiling point in early October 2023. Emma's behavior had become increasingly erratic, and the carefully constructed image of their family was now nothing more than a crumbling facade. It was during one of their heated arguments that Emma dropped a bombshell: she was pregnant. Her announcement, however, was laced with confusion. She claimed the baby was Tom's, but the doubt that had been festering for months now grew into a storm of suspicion. Tom, still reeling from the discovery of Emma and Mason's affair, found himself unable to trust her. Emma's cryptic demeanor only intensified his doubts. She refused to explain when he asked simple questions about the timing of her pregnancy or why, after months of turmoil, she suddenly seemed so desperate to hold on to the family she had already torn apart. For days, Tom was consumed by the thought of this new revelation. He pushed it to the back of his mind, trying to keep his cool, but the nagging question of whether the baby could actually be his or Mason's ate away at him. It wasn't until a week later, after a particularly cold evening of silence between the couple, that Mason finally spoke up. In the quiet, dimly lit living room, Mason, his face pale and filled with shame, approached his father. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice shaking. Tom looked up from his newspaper, startled by the seriousness in his son's tone. Mason paused before finally blurting out the truth. "Dad, the baby might be mine." The words hit Tom like a sledgehammer. His heart seemed to stop beating for a moment, and the room spun as the world around him blurred. Mason's eyes were filled with guilt, but there was no denying the truth. The weight of the confession crushed Tom, leaving him breathless. The betrayal wasn't just a secret, it was an agonizing reality that his own son was involved in an affair with his wife, and now, a child was on the way. "I never wanted it to happen, Dad. It just happened. I don't know what to do anymore," Mason said, his voice barely a whisper. Tom's jaw clenched. The rage and disbelief boiled over, but it was quickly replaced by heartbreak. He stumbled to his feet, feeling like the ground beneath him had given way. This is not real. "How could you do this?" he muttered, his eyes welling with tears. The night that followed was filled with a storm, not just the thunder crashing outside, but a storm of emotions inside the house. By the time the clock struck midnight, the Cartwrights were on the edge of disaster. The thunderstorm outside raged, its winds howling and lightning flashing through the windows, as if the heavens themselves were reflecting the chaos that had taken root within the family. Inside, Emma and Tom's confrontation reached its peak. Tom demanded the truth, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and pain. "Tell me, Emma," Tom shouted over the deafening crack of thunder. "Who's the father? Who's really behind this?" Emma stood in the doorway, her eyes filled with an icy defiance. "You're not fit to question me, Tom," she spat, her voice rising with fury. "You couldn't even see what was right in front of you. You're the one who failed this family, not me." Her words stung, each one a calculated strike designed to wound, to shift the blame. But Tom was past the point of listening to her accusations. The betrayal had already torn through him like a knife, and now, Emma was pushing him to his limits. In a desperate attempt to end the confrontation, Emma stormed into Mason's room, her footsteps heavy and purposeful. "Mason, come with me," she called, her voice a command. Mason, standing frozen at the door, hesitated. He looked at his father, then at his mother, knowing that no matter what, he was trapped in the middle of a war he had never wanted. "Mom, please," he pleaded softly, "this isn't the time." But Emma, her face twisted in a mix of rage and desperation, pulled him into the fray. "Now, Mason," she shouted. Mason reluctantly stepped into the hallway, and the scene inside the house grew even more chaotic. Emma's accusations echoed through the walls, louder and sharper with each passing moment. "Tom, you never loved me. You didn't care. You were too busy being a cop, too busy ignoring what I needed. And now, you think you have the right to question me? Tom's fists clenched, his body trembling with anger. How could you do this to me? To our family? His voice was raw, barely controlled. Mason tried to intervene, his voice shaking as he stepped between his parents, desperate to calm the situation before it spiraled further. Dad, please, Mom, let's just talk this out. This isn't the way. But the words hung in the air, drowned out by Emma's escalating tirade and Tom's relentless demands for answers. The years of anger, resentment, and betrayal reached a breaking point, and nothing could stop the inevitable. Tom's fury reached its peak as Emma screamed, accusing him of being a failure as a husband, a father, and a man. Her words cut deep, and in a blind, heartbroken rage, Tom snapped. He couldn't take it anymore. The weight of the lies, the deceit, and the humiliation had pushed him past the edge. In that final, shattering moment, the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside the Cartwright household. As thunder cracked overhead, the violence of emotions inside that home reached a terrifying crescendo, and in the darkness, something irreversible occurred. The night of the murder was a stormy one in Savannah, with rain lashing against the windows of the Cartwright family's suburban home. The wind howled outside, drowning out the rising tension within the house. Inside, the air felt thick with unspoken anger and betrayal. For weeks, the discord between Tom and Emma had been simmering, with every argument a step closer to the breaking point. Tom, enraged by the affair and the bombshell pregnancy revelation, had been unable to contain his fury. That night, he finally confronted Emma, unable to hold back any longer. The confrontation took place in their bedroom, the room where they had once shared intimate moments. But now, it had become a battleground. Tom was livid, his voice harsh and demanding answers. Emma, defensive and desperate, stood her ground. Her tone was equally venomous, attempting to justify her actions. She accused Tom of neglecting her emotionally, of failing to truly understand her needs. She lashed out, claiming that Mason was the only one who truly understood her, her words soaked with desperation. She had been playing a dangerous game, and now, the consequences were closing in on her. Tom, disgusted by the twisted nature of Emma's words, felt his anger boil over. He called her a predator, his voice sharp and unforgiving. In a burst of fury, he vowed to report her, threatening to expose the affair to the authorities and destroy everything she had built, her influencer empire, her carefully constructed online persona, the life she had so meticulously crafted. This was her worst nightmare come to life. Emma, horrified by the thought of losing it all, grew hysterical. Her hands trembled as she tried to make Tom see things from her perspective, but her words only added fuel to the fire. She accused him of failing her as a husband, of never truly being there for her. Her emotions were a whirlwind, every sentence an attempt to control the situation, to manipulate Tom into backing down. Unable to contain herself, she stormed out of the bedroom, heading toward Mason's room. The storm outside seemed to match the fury building inside her. She yelled as she walked, her voice shrill with the weight of her emotional collapse. She needed Mason, he was the one who had to stand by her now. She shouted that he had to protect their special bond, urging him to help her against his father's threats. The more she shouted, the more desperate she became. She couldn't face losing everything. Mason, who had been locked in his room, was in a state of shock. He had heard every word of the escalating argument, every accusation that had been hurled between his parents. He felt paralyzed, torn between his love for both of them and the guilt of his own actions. He was deeply conflicted, a young man caught in the grip of something he could not escape. When Emma burst into his room, still shouting, he pleaded with her to leave him alone. His heart pounded, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. But Emma wouldn't stop. She cornered him, her eyes wild with desperation, demanding that he defend her against his father's threats. She was unwilling to let him go, unwilling to let him escape from the life she had trapped him in. Mason, trying to push past her, begged her to stop, but Emma was relentless. She screamed that he couldn't ruin her life, that he had to be there for her, no matter the cost. It was at that moment that Tom, his rage still boiling over, barged into the room. His service weapon was drawn, his eyes frantic with the need to stop Emma from manipulating their son any further. He had grabbed the gun moments earlier, intending to use it to scare her into leaving Mason alone, to force her to back down from her destructive path. But the situation had spiraled too far out of control. Emma, now completely out of control herself, lunged at Tom, her hands outstretched, slapping him across the face as she screamed that he was trying to destroy their family. Her fury was like a wild animal, and she wasn't backing down. In the chaos that followed, Mason, torn between his parents, rushed forward in an attempt to de-escalate the situation. He reached for the gun, hoping to stop the madness. But the struggle was violent, and in the frenzy, the gun discharged. There was a sharp, deafening sound, and Emma collapsed to the floor, a gunshot wound to her chest. Blood quickly began to pool around her, staining the carpet beneath her. Mason froze, his hands shaking as he stared down at his mother, the woman he had once known as the center of his world. His mind refused to comprehend the scene before him. Tom, equally stunned by the rapid turn of events, stood frozen in place, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he processed the horror of what had just occurred. The weapon still gripped tightly in his hand, it felt heavier than ever. He had never intended for any of this to happen. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, everything in the room seemed to fade into a blur. Mason, his eyes wide with shock, knelt beside Emma's body, cradling her head in his lap. His voice was barely a whisper as he cried out, his words a mix of disbelief and heartbreak. "Mom, no. Please, no." But there was no response. Emma was gone, her life snuffed out in an instant. Tom, realizing the gravity of the situation, stumbled backward. The room felt suffocating, the weight of the tragedy pressing down on him. In a haze of panic, he grabbed his phone and dialed 911. His voice cracked as he spoke, the words coming out in a disjointed stream. I've shot my wife, it was an accident, please, help." The dispatcher on the other end tried to steady him, asking him to stay calm and provide the necessary details. Tom's hands trembled as he gave their address, his gaze fixed on the bloodied body of his wife. Every part of him wanted to wake up from this nightmare, but he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. By the time the police arrived, the scene had been set, the family's world shattered. Mason was covered in his mother's blood, still in a daze, unable to process what had just happened. His eyes met his father's, but there was no understanding between them, no words to explain the unspeakable horror they had both just witnessed. Tom's story to the authorities was full of contradictions, his explanation of the events faltering. He described the shooting as a struggle gone wrong, but the inconsistencies in his words and the blood-stained scene suggested otherwise. And as Mason stood silently beside his mother's body, the full weight of their tragedy had only just begun to sink in. The investigation into Emma's death quickly became a maze of conflicting testimonies, evidence, and a web of emotions that clouded the truth. When detectives arrived at the scene, they carefully examined the blood-spattered room and the position of the bodies. The house was eerily silent, with only the sounds of raindrops pelting against the windows and the distant wail of sirens. In the cold, dim light, the investigators began their painstaking work, knowing that the answers would not come easily. Forensic experts began their analysis, and the gunshot trajectory immediately raised questions. The angle of the wound suggested that Emma had been leaning forward when the shot was fired. She hadn't been standing still, nor had she been directly facing Tom. The position of the body indicated that she had been closer to Mason, perhaps even moving toward him, when the shot rang out. This evidence contradicted the initial claim made by Tom, who insisted that Emma had been lunging toward him and that Mason shot her in self-defense. Meanwhile, a deep dive into Emma's private life painted a more chilling picture. Detectives discovered a hidden journal tucked away in Emma's personal effects, a seemingly innocuous object, but it held dark secrets. The pages were filled with manic entries, obsessive thoughts, fears, and confessions. Emma's writings revealed the depth of her obsession with Mason. She wrote about the special bond they shared, describing it as something that no one, not even her husband, could understand. She feared losing control over Mason, her possessive grip on him tightening with each passing day. In one of her entries, she confessed, "I will never let him go, no matter what. He's mine." The unsettling words gave a glimpse into her twisted view of their relationship, a view that went far beyond motherly affection. The investigation took another disturbing turn when voice messages from Emma to Mason were uncovered. These messages, stored in Mason's phone, were intimate and controlling, laced with manipulation. Emma's voice, frantic and pleading, echoed through the phone speaker. In one message, she demanded, "You can't leave me, Mason. I need you, and I won't let you go. Do you understand? I'll make sure of it." These recordings made it clear that Emma's control over Mason had intensified as the relationship deepened, and her fear of losing him had become a constant driving force. The conflicting testimonies only added to the confusion. Tom, devastated and confused, stuck to his version of events. He claimed that Mason had acted in self-defense, that Emma had become violent and aggressive, and that Mason had shot her in an attempt to protect both himself and Tom. His testimony was filled with anguish, but there was a sense of denial too, as if he couldn't bring himself to fully accept the reality of the situation. He described the moment when Emma had lunged at him and Mason, and how Mason had grabbed the gun to try and stop the altercation, but the shot had accidentally gone off. Mason, on the other hand, was in a state of shock. His testimony was hesitant and fractured, as if he was still grappling with the horror of the night. He confirmed that he had grabbed the gun in an effort to stop the chaos, to prevent further escalation. He insisted that the gun had discharged accidentally, his voice breaking as he recounted the tragic events. "I didn't mean to," he said repeatedly, his eyes wide with guilt and confusion. His version of events seemed plausible, but the evidence was starting to suggest that things hadn't been as accidental as they appeared. The forensic analysis revealed something more unsettling. The trajectory of the shot, combined with the gunpowder residue found on both Mason's hands and Tom's, suggested that there might have been more deliberation involved than either man had admitted. The physical evidence hinted that the gun had been fired in close proximity to Emma, but it wasn't clear who had actually pulled the trigger. Both Tom and Mason's accounts seemed to conflict with the evidence in subtle but important ways. The investigators weren't sure if the shooting had been a tragic accident or a more deliberate act of violence. The fact that Emma's obsession with Mason had become so all-consuming raised the possibility that she had tried to manipulate or control him to the point of no return. Had she pushed him too far, leading to a violent outburst? Or had Tom's involvement in the confrontation triggered a fatal escalation? The presence of both men's fingerprints on the gun only muddied the waters further, leaving law enforcement to question the true nature of the incident. As the investigation unfolded, one thing was clear: the Cartwright family's image of perfection had been shattered forever. Behind the carefully curated Instagram posts and the glossy family photos, there had been a storm brewing, one that no one had seen coming. Now, the detectives had to piece together the puzzle of a shattered family, a twisted love, and a deadly secret. But the truth, if it was ever to be fully uncovered, remained elusive. The courtroom was packed to capacity, the tension palpable as the trial of Mason Cartwright for the involuntary manslaughter of his mother, Emma Ray Cartwright, commenced. The once glossy facade of the Cartwright family had completely crumbled, and now, in front of a packed courtroom, the raw, painful truth of their fractured lives was laid bare for all to see. Mason, just 18 years old, sat at the defense table, his face pale and drawn. His hands trembled as he clutched the edge of the table, unable to shake the memories of that fateful night. His defense attorney argued that Mason had acted out of fear and confusion, overwhelmed by his mother's manipulation and the explosive confrontation that had unfolded in the house that stormy night. The defense painted Mason as a victim, a young man caught in the web of his mother's unhealthy obsession, a victim of her psychological hold on him. Mason did not intend to harm anyone, the defense attorney argued. He was simply trying to stop the violence, to stop the chaos that had overtaken his home. The tragedy of that night was an accident, one that no one could have foreseen. But the prosecution had a different narrative, one that painted Mason as complicit in the deadly affair that had torn their family apart. They argued that Mason's involvement in the affair was not a simple mistake but a choice that had led directly to Emma's death. The prosecutor's voice rang out across the courtroom, condemning Mason for engaging in a relationship with his mother, a relationship that was both emotionally manipulative and morally corrupt. This wasn't just a tragic accident, the prosecutor argued. This was the result of years of manipulation, obsession, and secrecy. Mason's actions, and his failure to stop the escalating situation, were just as much to blame as the violent confrontation itself. The courtroom was silent as the words sank in, each one a dagger aimed at Mason's fragile sense of self. As the trial continued, the public's reaction became a frenzy. The case had captured the nation's attention, not just for the horrific nature of the crime, but because of the complexities that lay beneath the surface. Emma's followers, who had once adored her for her relatable family content, were now divided. Some condemned her as a predator, a manipulative figure who had preyed on her son's vulnerability. These individuals scoured social media for evidence of Emma's obsession, sharing snippets of her voice messages, journal entries, and even the private conversations between her and Mason. "She was a monster in disguise," one user wrote in a viral post, sharing a video clip of Emma's obsessive messages to Mason. "She controlled him, and when he tried to break free, she trapped him further." Others, however, sympathized with Emma, painting her as a woman driven to desperate measures by a failing marriage and the pressures of her public persona. "She was a mother first, and she was pushed to the edge by Tom's neglect and cruelty," one fan wrote, defending Emma's actions. "Mason was just a victim of their broken family. He shouldn't be blamed for the tragedy." This camp viewed the trial as an attack on a woman who had been trapped in an impossible situation, a woman who had lost herself in the pursuit of a perfect image, only to find that the truth of her life had been far darker than anyone could have imagined. But it was the reaction to Tom's role in the case that caused the most controversy. Tom, as a respected police officer, had always been a pillar of the community. His image had been tarnished by the revelation of his wife's affair with their son, but even more damning was his failure to act in the moments leading up to Emma's death. Critics lambasted him for not intervening sooner, for not recognizing the signs of his wife's manipulations, and for failing to protect Mason from the toxic situation that had consumed their home. "He was the one who should have stepped in," one commentator said, his words sharp and unforgiving. "He was supposed to be the protector, the one who could have stopped this tragedy before it ever happened." Despite the public outcry, Tom faced no charges. His actions, or lack thereof, in the months leading up to the murder were questioned, but ultimately, there was no evidence to suggest that he was directly involved in the shooting. He remained steadfast in his testimony, insisting that he had never intended for anyone to be hurt, that the events had spiraled out of control, and that he was equally devastated by what had transpired. Still, the public saw him as complicit in his own way, by choosing to ignore the growing tension and failing to address the dangerous relationship between Emma and Mason. Social media platforms exploded with debate. Supporters of Mason defended him vehemently, arguing that he had been manipulated by both his mother and his father, trapped in a chaotic family dynamic that no one could have possibly understood. "Mason was just a kid who was caught in the middle of his mother's insanity," one person wrote. "He didn't deserve to be vilified." On the other hand, there were those who believed that Mason should face the full consequences of his actions, claiming that his involvement in the affair made him equally responsible for his mother's death. "He wasn't a victim. He was part of the problem," another user posted, sharing photos of Mason from his social media accounts, highlighting his role in perpetuating the toxic family dynamic. The case sparked discussions on a much larger scale, the blurred lines between manipulation and love, the dangers of social media facades, and the emotional and psychological toll that living under a public microscope can have on a family. As the trial continued, it became more than just a legal proceeding, it was a societal reflection of the pressures and complexities that people face in the modern world, where truth and perception are often intertwined, and the cost of secrets can be devastating. In the trial's climactic moment, Mason took the stand and tearfully recounted the events of that night, revealing Emma's final words before the gun went off, "You'll never escape me." The room fell silent as Mason's voice cracked with emotion, his body trembling. His testimony laid bare the haunting manipulation he had suffered, and those chilling words, spoken by Emma in her final moments, were enough to sway public opinion. It seemed clear to many that Mason had been a victim of his mother's obsessive control, a young man who had been trapped in a cycle of guilt, fear, and manipulation. Yet, despite the emotional weight of his testimony, the jury remained divided on whether his actions were truly self-defense or a moment of calculated desperation. Mason was ultimately convicted of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 5 years in a juvenile detention center with the possibility of parole. It was a sentence that both reflected the tragic nature of the events and left many questioning whether true justice had been served. As for Tom, the public scrutiny became too much to bear. He resigned from the police force, unable to face the community that once revered him. Alone and in seclusion, Tom was left to grapple with the guilt of not having stopped the unraveling of his family sooner. His life, once filled with purpose, now felt empty, consumed by regret and self-loathing. Emma's story, once the centerpiece of a thriving influencer career, became a cautionary tale of a family destroyed by secrets, manipulation, and the dark side of social media fame. Her death was immortalized as a shocking reminder that even the most picture-perfect lives can hide unimaginable darkness. This tragedy is a haunting reminder of how secrets and betrayal can destroy even the strongest bonds. Emma's obsession, Mason's vulnerability, and Tom's silence led to a chain of events that shattered their family, and their lives. In the end, what was once a seemingly perfect, picture-perfect family was reduced to a tragic cautionary tale, one where the cost of keeping hidden truths was far too high. What do you think? Was this a case of self-defense or a crime born out of desperation? And how can we prevent tragedies like this in a world full of secrets and pressure? If this case shocked you, like and subscribe to True Crime Files, HQ for more tales of betrayal, tragedy, and the dark truths behind seemingly perfect lives.